This is a review of the 1954 Vincente Minnelli film, The Long, Long Trailer, which stars Lucille Ball and, of course, Desi Arnaz. No, this is not a lengthy preview, a long, long trailer for another movie. It is, in fact, a movie about van life from the 50s. I don't have a ton to say about this movie, to be honest, so this might be a somewhat short video. You also might hear some fireworks in the background, but don't worry, unless my apartment catches on fire or something. In which case I probably won't end up publishing the video. Anyway, the story is pretty straightforward. Two newlyweds buy a van. This is obviously Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, who were married in real life and who, of course, were co-stars in the extremely popular and pioneering television show I Love Lucy that was produced. This movie came out while that show was on the air and being produced and such. Anyway, the newlyweds, they buy a van rather than a house. They have to get to Colorado from Los Angeles, and they decide to buy a van and to live in it and drive out there. Essentially, this is kind of a CinemaScope travel film. This was a period in time where there were sort of bigger movies that were trying to sort of rival television, or trying to outdo television by having really big scenery, really big cinematography. This was why widescreen was invented and why formats like CinemaScope were popular. So big sort of color travel movie. But this movie doesn't explore the remote reaches of Portugal or the Madeiras or something like that. That is Portugal, I guess. But rather America, the highway in between LA and Colorado. They visit some landmarks like Yosemite. You pass through Yosemite in this movie. And you get to know some of the locals, some of the natives, which are kind of interesting. Is this movie a spoof of people who own trailers, or is it a glamorization of trailers? Well, it's kind of both. And this is a very common thing for sort of movies of this era, and even movies now, to maybe kind of have some satirical elements to them, to maybe sort of play up certain elements. For instance, a big part of this movie is that the trailer life ends up being very expensive. So they go to a trailer convention in the beginning of the film once they've decided maybe they're interested in trailers, and they get excited about all these trailers, and then it starts to become clear how expensive things are. They buy a trailer, they're quoted a very low cost, and then, of course, there's taxes, and there's fees, and there's all kinds of things that you need to buy. And so in that regard, there's a little bit of an element of a spoof there. This reminds me somewhat, by the way, of the interesting little-known movie Mr. Blandings Builds His Dream House, which I would recommend. But is this a deep satire that's really looking at sort of the core issues in societies or something like that? Well, absolutely not. This is a toothless satire, a blank comedy sort of thing that exaggerates certain costs or things like that for comedic effect, but doesn't really make any swings. This movie has a lot in common with I Love Lucy, and one of the main reasons why I think this video is going to be so short is because I don't know very much about I Love Lucy. I've thought about watching it a few times, but to be honest, I find it so just not very funny or entertaining that I've never ended up watching it all. But I have a little bit of a sense. So I think I Love Lucy falls into a very broad category of sort of mainstream media, particularly from that time, that are kind of revolutionary, but also really not revolutionary. So kind of revolutionary. How is that? Well, for one thing, Lucy, I think, in the show, and Tacy, I think is the name of the character, very similar character in this movie, have a sort of sass. They have a kind of spunk or something like that. They have a very stylish way of finding their own place in society or something like that. And in particular, I think that Lucille Ball may be a little bit more of an every woman or something like that, right? So potentially relatable. Desi Arnaz, of course, is Cuban, and it's kind of surprising that a major show like this would have a Hispanic actor as the husband or something. And this was something that networks were not a big fan of. They did not like this idea, but it went ahead nonetheless, and the show became very popular. And so, like I said, it's kind of doing something different. It's kind of subverting some of your expectations, but at the same time, it's not really revolutionary at all because it is a domestic drama, which does not mean merely a drama set in a house, but is a drama about all the little mundane, quotidian details of life and such. So many sitcoms end up being like this. The old, oh, well, let's have the husband and wife switch for a day so they can learn what it's really like or something like that. That would be a plot line you'd expect to find in these things, and of course, you find it here. The wife wanting to go out and get a job, and then that being an affront to the husband. I don't know if that happens in I Love Lucy, but I'm sure it does at some point. Happens in tons and tons of sitcoms. These plots get reused over and over again. At the end of the day, these mainly reaffirm traditional values. And so these tend to be not very revolutionary at all. And so similarly to how there's a little bit of a double, maybe a slight amount of a double meaning here, where some people might look at this and say, wow, this is a great spoof of trailers or a great satire about it. But it's also sort of glamorizing these things and is ultimately toothless. Well, similarly, some people might really identify with Lucille Ball as sort of some spunky every woman or something like that. At the same time, it is a very sort of mundane drama reaffirming traditional values. Interesting. In this movie, one way to think about this is with portable domesticity, right? So we leave the traditional setting of the sitcom, which is the apartment, right? The groomed domestic space, and we take it on the road. There's a great scene in this movie. Not great as in funny, because it's not very funny, but great as in it really sums up a lot of what this movie is about, at least subconsciously, where Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz are reviewing their journey so far, and they conclude that they're not having a great time because they spend so much time driving, and Tacy, Lucille Ball, never has time to prepare dinner, or she can't start preparing dinner until they stop, and so they end up eating really late, and they don't have any time to do any fun stuff. Interesting side note here about the trailer, by the way, and the road trip and such, is that this, of course, plays into the American love affair with the car. And such. And of course, there's a little bit of a spoof of that to some degree, but like I said, toothless satire. So what was I saying? Right. They conclude that to get more time in their day, what they'll do is have Tacy start cooking while they're still on the road. What could possibly go wrong? Gee, I don't know. So there's a scene, of course, where she tries to cook in the back, and Desi Arnaz, of course, gets carried away singing a song to himself. This is sort of a musical. It has 1.5 musical numbers in it or something. But gets sort of carried away singing a song to himself about the dinner they're going to have, and starts driving faster and faster. And, of course, Tacy in the back gets thrown all over the place and becomes very dirty. One other interesting aspect of this film is the literal dirtying of Tacy, Lucille Ball's character, which happens twice in the movie. First, well, actually, this is the second time when she's trying to cook in the back, and she gets sort of covered with flour and such. And this is, I think, a particularly visceral kind of thing. The woman being sort of unclean, being covered in flour or something like that. A horrible miscarriage of domesticity, basically, and a crime against hygiene, right? Which, anyway, hygiene, very interesting subject. Might do a video on it at some point. The national aspect of hygiene. And just to put that in the context, when she gets dirty and commits this crime against hygiene, could she also be committing some sort of crime against the nation or some sort of crime against society by being an unclean woman, or something along those lines, right? Obviously, that's not an accusation I make, but one that the movie is sort of making subconsciously. So you see it also earlier in the movie. She, in what I guess is supposed to be a hilarious bout of slapstick comedy, she is thrown out of the door of the trailer once into a big puddle of mud and gets completely covered in mud. Again, gross miscarriage of domesticity and a crime against hygiene. Interesting. So to get back to the scene that I was planning to talk about, she's in the back trying to make dinner. Of course, it goes horribly wrong. Now, one of the things that's sort of interesting about this is, like I said, one of the ways that this movie sort of spoofs or parodies sort of, middle class life or upper middle class life comes right before the scene, because Lucille Ball talks about how she's going to prepare this extremely complex meal with ragu and such, and the Desi Arnaz suggests, oh, well, I can help. So ragu and a Caesar salad. He says for the Caesar salad, oh, I can help cut the greens. And she says, no, you don't cut greens for a salad. You tear them. What are you thinking? Right? So there's this sort of spoof of like a hyper specific type of cooking that the upper middle class might obsess over making Caesar salad with the greens cut as opposed to chopped, or something like that. But on the other hand, this is another scene that kind of goes both ways here, because is that actually a spoof, or on the other hand, is the joke on Desi Arnaz all along, not knowing anything about cooking, and actually it should, like, perhaps the movie is saying that a becoming housewife should know these things to some extent. Well, it's not really clear which way it's going, and it's kind of going both ways rather than neither. So anyway, point is she's cooking while moving, and this is the sort of very clear metaphor of a portable domesticity, right? Taking the apartment on the road. So despite all these circumstances and despite all this stuff going on, she's still trying to do the domestic. And this, again, connects back to the sort of double-sided nature of this whole thing, where on the one hand, they're doing something totally different, totally out there. They're taking a van life and such. But on the other hand, they're doing something extremely mainstream and normal and mundane, and in fact, trying to carry over that life into this new context. So should we applaud their spunk, their grit and tenacity for giving it a go, for trying to make the ragu and the Caesar salad on the road? Or are they perhaps totally incapable of escaping society? And is this a completely milquetoast, an uninteresting movie? Well, some of both, perhaps. But do I recommend this? Well... here's what I'd say. This movie's not funny at all, in my opinion. If you like Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, you might like this movie. If you really like, I Love Lucy and want more, then here's more. This movie is delightfully odd in some ways. Like, the trailer that they've gotten, it is great. It's a real trailer, huge. It's very long. The decor is great, really out there. This is maybe some of Vincente Minnelli's influence coming through. Some of the photography is interesting, some of the cinematography. Unfortunately, I think that it's kind of hard to find this movie in its original aspect ratio, like its original widescreen aspect ratio. Mine seemed like it was cropped. There are some other sort of delightfully odd bits, like there's some drama around backing a trailer at one point. This is another sort of running joke in the movie, is that it's just very hard to drive these things. The trailers are extremely expensive and they're hard to drive, so they go to visit Tacy's in-laws at one point, and Desi Arnaz says, "Oh, I've got it all down. I've got it figured out. The first 50 miles were tough, but now I can drive it anywhere." And they say, "Okay, well, why don't you park in our driveway? Go ahead and back it in." And he says, "Back it in." This isn't exactly funny, but it is maybe delightfully odd to see a movie where a bunch of the drama, one dramatic opinion of the movie, is trying to back a trailer. That's not super common. In a lot of ways, though, this movie does copy and is kind of a ripoff of another movie where that kind of thing happens. I think, I'd have to double check the years on this. Let me just put it this way. There's another movie about sketchy driving that's way better, which is called The Wages of Fear, one of the most suspenseful movies ever made, directed by Henri-Georges Clouzot. That may have come out in like 56, though. I don't quite remember. But around a similar time, either way. Anyway, so there's a delightful oddness to it. I mentioned some interesting things about it, sort of intellectually, about sort of the double-sided nature of these things, the movie being sort of revolutionary and also sort of not revolutionary. I don't really recommend the movie for checking that out, because the reality is that is extremely, extremely common for there to be sort of toothless satire. Most 1950s movies fall into that. There are 1950s movies that have other really interesting things at play underneath. I think I've highlighted some of them, right? Cars are specific. Oh, there's also some great hilarious jokes about women drivers in this movie, of course. So there are a couple of other sort of interesting schisms that bubble up from under the surface, but not as many as in some other movies, honestly. And if you want a movie that's sort of a case study of 50s melodrama, this isn't really it. There are movies that are more unintentionally sort of weird under the surface and things like that. And sort of the predominating thing about this, of the portable domesticity, is fairly straightforward and quite common. So this movie I don't think is very good to watch. I don't think it's funny. It is kind of odd. It does have some, it's got a long, long trailer. It delivers on that. Intellectually, it is quite similar to a lot of other content of that time. I think maybe if I knew more about I Love Lucy, maybe I would have more to say about this. But for now, that basically sums up the long trailer.